Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to follow up on the previous app video, and we're going to get into some things that are a little more advanced and just some things that kind of build on what we previously covered to give you a little bit more flexibility as far as working with some third-party options. We're going to touch on a couple more advanced things and get into how we can set automatic updates if you're running through the terminal. So to start, we're going to look at adding a repository. And the reason why you want to do this is sometimes it just might not be available in your distribution repositories. So it might be something third party where the only way to get it is to add the repository, or it may be that the developer project offers a repository that has a version that's more up to date than what's available within the official Debian repositories. And so for now, as an example, I'm going to install the browser LibreWolf. When we are setting up a third-party repository, you may see a little bit of variation in the instructions, and I'll try to kind of call some of that out and cover what you might see that's different. This one I'll say, and I'll include a link to their site to the install instructions for Debian, but I'm going to have a little bit of variation with the way I do it. I'm going to kind of tone it back to how you'd more generally do it. And so as part of the instructions, it calls out some packages that you need to install. The only tool that actually needs to be installed here is the GNU PG package. That'll have all the tools we need for validating keys for the repository. So we'll install that. And so if you're interested in LibreWolf and you want to learn more about it and install it, and you do kind of follow this as a guide, you may see some variation on the instructions, as I mentioned. Like there is a part of the commands they give you to run that will grab your OS release. And then as far as a Debian-based install, it's going to install for Debian, Ubuntu, and Mint. As far as Debian, I believe they only support 11 and 12. There are other distros as well that it will install on. But anyways, we're not going to set that variable. I'm going to actually set that up manually for those that are less familiar with that. And so before we move on and I start running the rest of the commands, I just want to run through a quick high level of what it is to add a new repository. And so the first thing we want to do is we want to get a key because we want to make sure that we can validate the signature on the repository. That way we make sure that it is actually a legit repository. And if we don't have a key that matches what was signed on the repository, then we'll actually get an error when we run the update command. So that needs to be in place. And so we'll add that key to our keyring. Part of that process may be that we need to run the Dearmor command. That's kind of a way of encoding it with, from binary to text. And this is just a really quick explanation. I don't want to dive too deep into the tools there with the encryption and all that, but you may or may not have to run that through Dearmor. It just depends on the instructions you see because it's dependent on the way that the key was set up by the repository maintainer. And so the first thing we're going to do is grab the key. And when you're doing this, sometimes you'll see wget, sometimes you'll see curl. Sometimes you may be able to just click a link and download it right from the project page. You can use whatever tools you like, or you can just, if you're comfortable and you trust the site it's coming from, you can just copy and paste the script if you'd like to. Although when you do that, you should have an idea of what's going on. We'll install that. And now we will actually run the key through this. See, I found when I changed the order and I actually had output and the file after that the command did not work. So we'll go ahead and run that. We'll just check our files and there we go right there. Now we have that armored key. And so now we'll want to move that to our keyring. And now we need to add our entry. So one thing to point out real quick is that we put this in the etc/sources.list.d directory. And so that's kind of our extra configuration directory. We have an etc app sources file that has all of our our official Debian repositories in it. Whenever possible, I try to create a source file in this directory for our repository to keep it out of that file. It keeps it cleaner, it keeps it easier to kind of keep track of what's going on there and keeps everything separate. You may run into things that give you a script that will actually automatically place it there. If you're adding a third-party repository, you might see instructions that tell you to do so. And if you follow the instructions that I'm providing, you can kind of work out how to create that in its own file, and you don't have to place it there if you don't want to. Of course, it is your system, so you do it however you'd like. I'm just kind of rolling with what's typically kind of best practice and what keeps things nice and clean. And just a quick note about the naming of source files in this directory is file extensions actually do matter in this case. I know most of the time it doesn't matter on Linux, but in this case, it's actually looking for something either with .sources or .list. So it matters here. If you don't have that named properly, it's not going to pick it up. And so just a quick explanation, and we'll take a look at the standard format that we saw in the last video and how Debian created the official repository sources by default. But in this case, we basically have the same identifiers, just a little bit different format, kind of a key value format, right? So in this case, we have types, which is deb, then our URIs, and there's our URL to the repository. And of course, the suites in this case is going to be the distribution name, Bookworm, or Bullseye, if you were using 11, for example. And the way that LibreWolf has it up, components main, so that is going to be there like that. The architecture. And then this is the path to our key file so that we can validate the signature on the repository. And now we can see that it's actually fetching metadata from the repository here. So we know that that's successful and try to install LibreWolf. It is available for install. And so that kind of key value format we saw there for the data for the repository, when we set that up, that is called Debian or Deb 822 style format. The other format where it's all in one line is called one line style format. And so one thing I want to go over real quick before we move on, and we'll just take a look here at our standard sources.list. And so here we have our one line style format. And of course we have the type, our URI, our distribution name, and then in this case, we're grabbing main and non-free firmware, kind of the layout, a little bit of recap from our last video. And so the way these are ordered in here, if we had multiple listings in here where we had a package that was in multiple repositories, it is going to prefer the package from the item that is listed first, unless a newer package is available in one of the later listed repositories. Then from there, it's actually going to read from the etc apt sources.list.d directory, and there is some alphanumeric, I believe, sorting of that to read files first. So if you, for some reason, had repository set up where you might see the same package, that's kind of the order of preference. There is a caveat to that, kind of an exception, and I'm going to touch on that and explain it real quick here in a few moments coming up, but there's a couple more things I want to cover before we get there. Directory here, and I'm going to go ahead and just remove this. And then what we're going to do here is create we can actually set this up in the one line format. In this case, we have the key path in brackets here. And so it's a key value thing, signed dash by equals, and then the path to our key. so that we have that properly set up. And the same deal here, it's the type of deb. We have our URI here, which is our URL to our repository distro, and then we're grabbing from the main repo. And so once we're set there, we can go ahead and write our file. And if we do an update, we can see that we're grabbing our metadata there and package is available for install. So now I'm just going to talk about pinning very briefly. That way you can very selectively allow the newer packages specifically that you really need. I really kind of look at this as like a last resort. And if you really have a really good reason or you really need something with a specific feature, then go for it. Otherwise, I've found that really just checking with the project page and seeing if maybe they have their own repo or they offer a deb package right there that's newer than what's in the Debian repositories, or sometimes they offer an option to install from source. I know there's, kind of that has its own issues. I don't really have a problem with it most of the time. And so if I really want a newer feature and to get a newer version, that's usually the way I'll go. It is something that I would be willing to cover if there was enough interest, but there's so many things that can go wrong with setting things up like that I usually don't do that. I usually find that maybe backports is really the kind of the best option versus actually setting up repositories from testing or unstable and kind of pinning those packages and installing them. There's too many headaches to deal with, in my opinion. But if you're really interested, leave some comments and let me know, and I'll see if I can get something set up to demonstrate it. And so I do want to kind of go into where that policy is set up though, and show that there is something here that will help us out later. And we can see all this if we actually check out policy, and then it's going to show us a priority. Everything by default has a priority of 500. If you set up backports, it's going to have a priority of 100. So we can kind of see that everything here is set. So this is an exception to what I talked about earlier when I said that etc app sources.list, the order there in that file, and then it's going to kind of sort through things in the extra configuration directory, the etc apt sources.list.d directory. So if you have files with repos set up in there, then it's going to look there. And so one thing real quick here is this can be done per package. And so we'll take a look at what that shows when we run it for one package. And now we can see where it came from and our priority here. So, which again is probably the preferred way to do it instead of doing an entire repository. If you're going to set up pinning, is probably less likely to cause a catastrophe if you're just looking at setting up specific packages. Again, not going to cover that here. And I'm also going to run through apt-config real quick. There are a ton of settings we could do with a lot of customization. There are probably a ton of settings that you don't really want to mess with. So before you make any changes, just make sure you really understand what's going on and really understand what you're doing. I typically don't actually find any need to make any changes, but you never know. There might be something that you don't like that you do want to change. And so we can see our configuration in etc apt and in the apt.conf.d directory. And so just to take a quick look at one of those look like, and these are all default configurations, by the way. So this is what's here by default. And so here's an example of one that we have set up for auto remove and our settings. Just a quick look at how those are structured within one of these files. And so a quick example of a setting we might want to change might be that You want to install suggested packages by default, or maybe you want to remove the option, or I should say toggle the option that installs recommended packages by default so that it no longer does that. Those are a couple options you could change if you'd like. And I just want to point out that we can do an apt-config dump. And then you can see the value of all settings in here. And we can also check out what is set up in share. All right, examples. And so a quick explanation of this file is that it contains all possible settings and a brief explanation of what everything does. Roughly, some of it's a little bit vague, but here you go. You get some comments in there telling you what exactly a lot of it does, and then kind of tells you what kind of value it is. Like, here it's a bool, there it's a string. And so, of course, you can tune your system or even change outputs more well-tuned for whatever you want. It's your system. Go ahead. Just be careful. There's a lot of things in here that you could potentially break stuff with. So just be sure you are well aware of what's going on before you make those changes. And so actually, I'm going to cut this off here and wrap this one up. I was going to cover unattended upgrades, and that lets you set things up over the terminal so that you can run upgrades automatically. I'm going to save that for another video actually, because this will just be way too long if I do that. So I appreciate you watching the video. Please leave me a like and subscribe if you find my content helpful. Leave me comments and let me know if there are specific topics you'd like to see covered.